Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas, and you can find out more about us on our website, virginiainstitute.org, and you can find previous episodes of Freedom and Prosperity Radio on our YouTube channel. Just search Freedom and Prosperity at YouTube. Now, when we get into the subject of Virginia's governance, right now it seems like one of those target-rich environments where, where do you turn? And we're trying to get all of the different facets of what's being changed and challenged, but one of the evergreens is Virginia versus hospitals and hospital monopolies. And to join us to get into this a little bit, Navy captain, certified business builder, Jim Sherlock is on with us. Captain Sherlock, I appreciate you taking some time out with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
I am fine. Thank you for inviting me to your show.
Well, Virginia versus hospitals has always been a fascinating, I'll call it a relationship, because it seems like they go out of their way to discourage small startup medical practices and bend over backwards for big hospital corporations. And I think that's to the detriment of the medical service and, for the citizens in Virginia. Talk about that and expound on what could be done.
Well, I'll give you the core background of why that is true, why hospitals dominate the medical policy landscape in Virginia. I guess I could say that in my observation, the Department of Health is largely owned and operated by the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association, the lobby group for the hospitals. And the reason why that is, historically, is our Certificate of Public Need law. It was passed in 1973 and was passed in order to provide protection from Virginia's hospitals from competition. There was a lot of words in there otherwise, but that was the basis of it, and it was passed in a time where the Virginia's numerous black hospitals had closed because of the public accommodations laws, the civil rights laws of the 60s. This law was passed in 1973 to protect the white hospitals from competition.
Jeez.
And that competition, at the time, the law was written. It was written in order to make sure that the state put up a bulwark against expansion that would threaten the franchises of the existing hospitals. I mean, I guess the way it was written, if that was Virginia policy, then fair enough, I guess. But the way it was executed by the Department of Health was something entirely different. Department of Health was put in charge. They decided, without legislative language, authority but not the intent, to create regional monopolies pretty much every place in Virginia except where they live, that is, they being the employees of the Department of Health in Richmond. All of our other major metropolitan areas have a single hospital system that dominates. Well, what that has done, as they have issued these monopolies and then protected them, it has created the largest economic powers in each of the areas where they granted these monopolies. The hospital systems are the biggest economic engines, non-governmental economic engines in the case of Northern Virginia, but in the rest of Virginia, pretty much the biggest economic engines in their areas. That means they are in the legislative districts of the House and Senate of Virginia.
Was there, in 1973, historically, and I know you've researched this a lot, but I'm just curious, Was there a problem, or was it really the hospitals feeling? It was certainly back then you didn't have the media coverage that certainly could befall with all the different websites and blogs and radio programs, TV programs where something like this could get out. Was there really an issue in 1973 of
the issue in 1973 for the hospitals is that was the beginning of outpatient surgery. Okay, before 1973, if you wanted any kind of surgery, you went in the hospital.
Oh.
Starting in 1973 and going on to today, more and more surgeries can be done in an outpatient environment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the hospitals either wanted to stop that or control it. Okay, and so the Virginia's Certificate of Public Need law quite definitively did not only involve hospitals, but also ambulatory surgical centers.
Mm.
Okay, so each of those had to get a CHIT, if you will, a franchise from the state of Virginia through a system that was designed to make sure that incumbents had all the influence, but a system that would deliver these certificates to build or expand a hospital, build or expand an ambulatory surgical center, or crucially, buy any kind of diagnostic equipment for anybody. So it basically put doctors largely out of the business of owning their own surgical centers or diagnostic imagery centers because they simply would not get the certificates from the state.
Mm-hmm.
And the bulwark for that was the system was they each had a regional board that would review applications for certificates, and then those recommendations would go to Richmond that would review them again, and then the health commissioner would make a final decision.
Hmm.
Well, the history of that is just what you think it is. I'll give you one stark number. In Virginia, we have about 72 ambulatory surgical centers.
Okay.
Maryland has 526.
Holy cow.
So it worked. The unintended consequence, or maybe the intended consequence, but at least on paper the unintended consequence, was the monopolies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was the unintended consequence, at least like I said, in the language of the legislation. But the Virginia Department of Health and its regional districts that reviewed these applications came to its own conclusion that monopolies were the best way to go, except, like I said, in Richmond, where they all lived.
It seems like something where it must not have been a very hard sell to convince the government that the hospitals wanted them to become the arbiter of this medical care licensure, because then it puts the government into a position it never really had before over medicine, where hospitals were generally important parts of a community, but not run by the government in the way so often we see it now.
Well, you're absolutely correct. And there was a bifurcated decision matrix. The Democrats who ran the General Assembly in 1973 were the same people that brought you massive resistance.
Right.
They were Reconstruction segregationist, and that's the way they legislated. For them, this was a way to keep the black physicians whose hospitals had closed from opening their own clinics.
Mm. Right.
For the white hospitals, they didn't care black, white, or green. They just didn't want any competition. So it was a merging of different interests with the same outcome. And so that's how it started. And now that these huge multi-billion-dollar, untaxed largely multi-billion-dollar corporations are the dominant businesses in 90% of the House and Senate districts.
Who's going to vote against it? Right?
The incumbents vote against them at their peril.
is that it's interesting to hear that historical context of how they were able to use kind of the inherent racism of the Byrd machine and that era of Virginia politics to create this. But it also, whether intended or unintended, created this almost Munchausen's by government syndrome, where the government helped create an overtly expensive medical care system, economic model with monopolies, and then really the only person who can come and fix that then is the government.
Correct.
And what politicians
you've obviously done this before.
Well, I mean, I see it everywhere.
It's exactly right. If government will break something, and then it becomes that only more government will fix it.
So is there a way out of this? I mean, so often over the last 5 years, I've covered stories of where, either it's an MRI clinic or something that, a low-cost clinic in a small rural area that can't get started is trying to, and there's always the well-meaning challenger to some House or Senate seat that says, we're going to break up this, COPN issue, and it never happens.
I will tell you, as a close observer of the General Assembly, that the Republicans have come close when they had the majority more than once. And in 1989, the COPN law was actually repealed.
What?
It was repealed because when it was no longer a requirement of the federal government, which it was for a few years, Virginia repealed it. And it was due to they repealed it in 1989. It was supposed to take effect in 1991, and the hospitals weren't having any of it. So they went and just laid every bit of pressure they could on the House and Senate members, and they came back the next year and put it back in place.
Wow! Holy cow! I did not know that.
It rose like Phoenix, so it's how do we get that fixed? The only way you can get it fixed is by making the voters aware of what's going on. The other way to fix it, there is another way to fix it. The other way to fix it is the enforcement of the antitrust laws.
Yeah, that would be a great way to do it. Now, how do?
Let me tell you why there's two levels. The federal Justice Department, Antitrust Division, is held back by the fact that the monopolies that are in place were created by state action. It's called the State Action Doctrine for Enforcement of Federal Antitrust. It was a ruling in a court in the, 70s, and said that basically it's a crossover between federal and state sovereignty to sue for state actions. Okay, so it is not illegal for them to do it, but by policy, the Justice Department won't sue any of our massive regional monopolies, not only for the fact of their monopoly, which is generally not illegal, but for the actions that they take based on their monopoly, which is.
Right, yeah, that kind of restraint of trade is usually...
Okay, but the one that could easily do it is the state attorney general. But state attorneys general always want to be governor.
Right.
And that's not a good way to get to be governor, by upsetting the hospitals. But if he would just do his job and go either into federal court under federal antitrust law and sue, or go into state court under the Virginia Antitrust Act and sue, there's a prima facie case that they're guilty. Several of these major hospital systems are out in front, right in your face, guilty of violation of the antitrust laws.
Is there a way a civilian, a listener of the program, could bring a case themselves and force the issue?
Absolutely. That is the third way that it could be taken care of. Those would be class action suits, because it is demonstrable, for example, that a lot of our monopolized areas, that the patients pay more for their hospital services than they otherwise would if the local monopoly wasn't acting like a local monopoly. And so that class action would work. Class action by the doctors who are subordinate and held down by and denied career opportunities by the actions of these monopolies who oppose every one of their COPN applications, which is a tantamount to killing them, would also, in my view, succeed. Now, what's the issue with that? Why don't they just go ahead and do it? First is lawyers that'll take the case. Every major law firm virtually in Virginia is conflicted out of a case against Virginia hospitals because they all have Virginia hospital clients.
Oh, man. So you couldn't even go and find a... Oh, my gosh.
You could go to D.C. and find a lawyer, the law firm that would do it. You could go to Philadelphia and find a law firm that would do it. But those law firms have to consider cost-benefit analysis. Now, I think before too long, one of them will figure out that there's a hell of a lot of money there, because if you sue under federal or state antitrust law in a civil suit and win, you are entitled to treble damages.
Oh, yeah, I guess that's a pretty good payday for a lawyer.
So it'd be a colossal amount of money.
Yeah.
But here's the problem at kind of the local end. These monopolies are so dominant that God help a doctor's practice that went into court to sue the regional monopoly.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I can imagine the
retribution.
retribution.
I mean, they wouldn't get a referral for the rest of for their business lives.
Yeah. It would have to be the ultimate in sacrifice, which, often are the best things that happen in a society, is when somebody says, you know what, I pledge my life, my fortune, and my sacred honor to do something.
Or you could have something like the Virginia Department of Health, seeing all this, could quit en masse and cause a stir that way.
Oh, yeah. Well,
but they are appointed by the governor without review by the General Assembly. And a lot of them there's a couple of retired politicians on there, some big donors. You get the idea.
It's a nice retirement plan. All right, Captain, let me ask you this then, Jim. Is there a way, and I'm talking lowercase p politicking here, not, Republican versus Democrat, if in this era, this target-rich environment of Medicare for all, single-payer, government complete takeover of the medical industry, that you could convince hospitals that it's in their better interest to free this up now rather than be, nationalized like some oil field in Venezuela at some point by a future administration that has found enough poor patients who can't find decent health care to get them elected president and or a majority in the House and Senate in Washington?
You would think, I agree with you. I think that my conversations with a couple of them, because they do call me in for talk every once in a while.
They buy you lunch and say, I read your piece, and let's...
You son of a gun. Yeah, and they don't say gun. But at any event, I've told a couple of their very high senior officials of a couple of these hospital systems just what you said. I said, guys, you by your actions richly deserve Medicare for all. I mean, you've earned it by being a horrible example of what the opposition, the left, will call a market economy. But we haven't had a market economy in healthcare in Virginia since 1973.
Right. So I love when kids say that capitalism fails. I'm like, I can't recall capitalism happening in my lifetime. Never mind, the lifetime of the average 20-something.
This is, well, let me. I don't. There's a term I don't want to use here. I'm trying to avoid it, but militant countries
Okay.
have often enlisted their major industries as really as part of the government in order to carry out public policy, and that some of that turned to be vice versa. But the politicians in Virginia, because of the fierce political power of these embedded regional monopolies, but also because of their massive campaign donations, some of that goes from being it's legal, but it's unethical. And there's a lot of things that are legal that are unethical.
Oh, yeah.
But
I'd say half of them at least.
When you look at my article that you called me about, George Barker, I mean, I could give you a while on George Barker, but he was reelected 2-1. Mark Sickles, another one in my article, the delegate Democrat, was reelected by a margin of 4-1.
Yeah, you'd think they would feel, you know what, I'm pretty safe here. I could do
this. But they don't need $300,000 in donations from the hospital industry.
Right.
Okay, that becomes that has to be, at least on the part of the donors, considered to be transactional.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and why? I'll give you some more examples. Why would Dominion Energy give $15,000 to the Republican Commonwealth Leadership PAC and $10,000 to the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus on January 6th of this year, with no elections for another 2 years? So, I'm sorry, that is exactly what it looks like.
Well, it is interesting you bring up Dominion in this, because it seems like there's quite a campaign to, fight this Dominion's unholy alliance with elected politicians and the overseeing of their monopoly, but it's a blind eye to the hospitals.
It is a blind eye to the hospitals. They give them the power and no oversight, which is what COPN did. There is absolutely not one government employee who oversees the business activities of the hospitals after they've given them the guy who with the responsibilities of the Attorney General, but not one of them have ever done it. Because every single one of them we've ever had wanted to be governor.
At some point, it's sad that we're seeing that happen. Here in some of our areas, a guy like Creed Eads, who has never really faced a serious opponent in his 25th Senate seat, and has actually gone to battle against hospitals over the care that was denied his own son. Another case where you would say, here's somebody who should have a willing ear to this is. So give us an action item or two before we go, Jim, that the listener can take with them and write a letter, get ahead of this to try to push these, because I really think you see, the marketplace starts doing things like these Med Express places, but then they fall into the same thing, and they still have to get permission of UVA Hospital or Centara to open up.
Well, the action items for me are to try to influence the legislatures by embarrassing them in public, which I do in Brickens Rebellion on a regular basis now. But that only matters if somebody reads it. And it only matters but it doesn't matter as much as the utter dominance of the local economic, therefore political scenes by the hospitals and the districts of these guys. And so, absent an attorney general running on the platform that he's going to deal with this, he or she, I don't know a solution. So that's my recommendation. I would recommend that every single citizen insist that the next candidates for Attorney General in Virginia voice their commitment to enforcement of the Virginia Antitrust Act.
I love the idea. It's pretty straightforward, and it is what their job is on our behalf as our attorneys.
And then write the current guy at his office. I mean, go on their website and send him a message and say, look, we view with alarm the complete lack of enforcement, not just by you, but by your predecessors, of the Virginia Antitrust Act in the case of Virginia's monopoly hospital systems.
You know, and it's interesting because the current Attorney General has already announced his intention to run for the gubernatorial nomination. We could make it very clear in our letters that this would be a deal breaker if he didn't, stand up for the rights of the individual citizens.
I agree with you. Yeah. The single pressure point, that the only one I know about that has a chance of doing anything about this, is at the Attorney General level.
And given his political party affiliation, he'll be talking about health care
exactly.
Anyway. So.
Well, he'll be talking out of both sides of his mouth.
Well,
because I can show you the donations by the healthcare industry to his own PAC.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And that's where we have to call them on it. And hopefully he has a voracious opponent about it, both, as a governor and then erstwhile as the replacement Attorney General.
I'm certainly going to inform whoever opposes him. And I'm going to inform both candidates, because this is not a partisan issue.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely.
And I'm going to inform both candidates for Attorney General, or however many of them there are, of this issue, and ask for their
position
on it. And I'm going to encourage every Virginian and to do the same thing, because you're not going to get it done through the General Assembly, especially not led by Democrats, because they've been lied to for so many years by the hospitals. They tell them two things. They tell them that poor people are going to die in the streets if you repeal right. COPN, which is a blatant misrepresentation of the facts. And they tell them all the rural hospitals are going to close if you repeal COPN, which is an equally dastardly lie, because the COPN doesn't do anything for the rural hospitals. COPN only controls expansion. It doesn't do a thing for failure.
Ironically, in 2009, 2010, I was told in the buildup of the Affordable Care Act that the reason we needed it was because we had so few rural hospitals remaining. I don't know. Again, you talk about talking out of both sides of their face, Jim.
COPN states, or CON states as they're called, certificate of need states, across the board in the United States have fewer rural hospitals per state and per rural population than do market states that don't have con laws. It's not a close call.
Well, and certainly your explanation of how this all came to be in 73 makes a lot of sense to that as well, because rural farming communities might also be where you find a more ethnic population as well. And
you see, that's what I say this is a bipartisan issue in Virginia, because our poor communities in Virginia are represented virtually equally by Democrats and Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
The white Southwest regions are represented by Republicans, and the South Side, which south of Richmond, which is the most heavily African American area in the state and one of the most in the country, is represented by Democrats, as are the poor areas of the cities. So it's a bipartisan issue. COPN is a bipartisan issue.
We all need health care, and
yes, and it's not like it was on one side of the political ledger.
Yeah. And you pointed out they're giving money to both sides. So
equally. Yeah. The Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association, within about $9, gave the same amount of money to candidates of each party in the last election. They're bipartisan in trying to influence legislation.
This is true. Well, Jim, I appreciate your visit. And again, it's baconsrebellion.com. Keep reading his stuff there. But I think as 2021 approaches, this is something that's certainly not as eye-catching as the Second Amendment, issues, but one that should be and has been on this program anyway for years an issue. And we need to get it right. And I think you've given us some great things to work on. So I appreciate your visit this week, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was helpful, and I appreciate the call.